Today we wish to discuss something about inscriptions of Sanchi. Sanchi is a famous Buddhist settlement located in Madhya Pradesh. Around the 3rd century BC, some Buddhists came and settled there. They built small earthen mounds. Over a period of next couple of hundred years, they covered these earthen mounds with stone and they built beautiful gateways around it. We intend to focus on this particular series of stupas which were built in this period. But before talking about it, I will try to introduce you to the whole area of Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh, as you know, is in many ways an area which connects North India and South India. It was also a very important trading area because in the early historical period, this area was connected with Gujarat, especially the port city of Bharu-Kutch. So in that sense, many of the characteristics of Madhya Pradesh as an area show characteristics of both northern Indian traditions and southern Indian traditions. It's also useful for us to focus on the study of Sanchi because here you have a series of inscriptions which are donative in nature. Pilgrims who came here, they gave donations of small slabs of stone and they inscribed their names and some form of their identification on these stone slabs. They provide us some very useful idea about the nature of social structure in this particular area. So in a certain sense, these inscriptions are important because unlike the textual sources, unlike archaeology, here you have some information about the lives of common people. When we study archaeology, archaeology is largely nameless and faceless. We do not know the human beings who were behind the creation of this archaeological material. When we study literary sources, we have another kind of problem. Literature in general was created by the powerful and rich classes of India and it was consumed by the powerful patrician classes of India as such. So they seem to glorify the rich and powerful. In the case of Sanchi, we have this unique vision of reality of 2nd century BC India and Madhya Pradesh especially because this was a monument created by donations of common people. So in a certain sense, it provides us an insight into the lives of common people. So with this in mind, it will be an interesting exercise to examine these small pithy inscriptions from Madhya Pradesh, especially Sanchi, because they give us an insight into the social life, into the social histories of Sanchi. Now, I'm emphasizing the word social histories because most of the history that has been written focuses on history of a political nature, history where kings and conquerors are glorified. But now historians are also asking questions which move beyond the courts of kings. They try to ask questions about changes in the structures of family, changes in the position of women, changes in the nature of kinship and relationship of all these changes with the formation of state, with the formation of cities and with the emergence of various kinds of religious traditions. So in that sense, we are trying to ask very different questions compared to standard learning or writing of history as such. Now, Sanchi is a fabulous site apart from being a very beautiful place where many Buddhist monuments are located, it was a site which was continuously inhabited by Buddhist monks from the 3rd century BC to about the 13th century AD. That's a long period, a period of roughly 1600 years. After the 13th century, this settlement was abandoned and forgotten. It was only in the 19th century that this place was rediscovered by some English adventurers and archaeologists. After its rediscovery, it was extensively documented, many books were written about it, and since then there has been a continuous stream of writings about Sanchi. Among the earliest works, we have works by people like Alexander Cunningham, who wrote this book called the Bhilsa Topes, where he tried to create a history of this settlement in Madhya Pradesh. It was followed by books like Tree and Serpent Worship in Ancient India. Given the fact that many of the carvings in Sanchi are of trees and serpents, scholars thought that maybe this entire monument was about the custom of worshipping trees, about the customs of worshipping snakes, something which has a widespread prevalence in early India and also in later phases of history. Now, this kind of a tradition of work continued in the subsequent period, and people have tried to study Sanchi in different ways. But before talking about Sanchi inscriptions proper, I will talk about a couple of inscriptions which are very useful and very important. Perhaps the earliest inscription in Madhya Pradesh is to be found in Sanchi. This is an inscription of Ashok. In this inscription, Ashok admonishes Buddhist monks, and he says that the dissenting monks will be defrocked and thrown out of the Sangha. Now, this was a kind of statement which was very unlike the statements that Ashoka made in other inscriptions of those times. And that's why scholars have puzzled over the contents of this inscription. Because in other inscriptions, Ashok continuously talks about how people should be tolerant, how people should respect diversity, how people should be non-violent, all such values which are associated with his idea of Dhamma. But out here, he is saying that if Buddhist monks do not follow certain customs, certain rituals, they will be thrown out. Professor Romila Thapar has pointed out that perhaps this inscription was related to his personal faith, and Ashoka made a distinction between his personal faith and his role as a king, while the policy of Dhamma, his idea of Dhamma, was related to his persona as a king, where he was trying to bring different kinds of communities and groups into some kind of a harmonious existence within his empire. When he is talking about the Buddhist monks in Sanchi, he is possibly addressing a community to which he himself belonged. So out here, a different phase of Ashoka comes through as such. The other thing which is quite interesting from the point of view of inscriptions at Sanchi is that the Buddhist chroniclers repeatedly mention that Ashoka sent many preachers to different parts of the empire and different parts of the world to propagate Buddhism. Now, the interesting thing is that in Sanchi, we get to know from inscriptions that at least 5 or 6 Buddhist monks went to the Himalayan region to propagate Buddhism. So in a certain sense, here is a small example from inscriptional material of the kind that supports the chronicling tradition of Buddhism. Now, this particular inscription is followed in chronological terms by another inscription which has been found in the neighboring city of Vidisha. Vidisha was a famous trading settlement in the 3rd, 2nd century BC. Out here have been found the inscriptions of a person called Heliodorus. Heliodorus was a Greek ambassador in the court of a particular king who is mentioned as Bhagbhadra. Bhagbhadra has been identified with a Shunga king who was supposed to be ruling over this part somewhere in the 2nd century BC. Now, the interesting thing about Heliodorus' inscriptions is that out here he calls himself a Bhagavat, meaning a follower of the tradition of worship connected with God Vishnu. Now, this in itself is interesting because we are normally used to thinking that the Brahmanical traditions were closed traditions and they would not allow people who were not part of the Brahmanical tradition to adopt Brahmanical gods to become Bhagavatas, for example. That has been the normal notion of Hinduism or Brahmanism that prevails today. But here is an example of a Greek who would be a foreigner, who would be a mlech in other ways of looking at things. He is proudly proclaiming himself as a follower of Vishnu. Incidentally, this is also the earliest inscriptional information about Vaishnavism as a tradition in Indian history. Now, coming from that, we will need to discuss some things which relate to the traditions that we find in Sanchi. As pointed out earlier, the Sanchi inscriptions are one-line statements. There will be statements like a gift of Ujjenak, which simply means this is a gift from a particular person who might have a name, who is an inhabitant of Ujjain. Now, what happens in this case is that the people, because of the language that is being used here, which is a version of Prakrit, that language tells us through its genitive case endings whether the person who is giving the donation is a male or a female. In most of the cases, they also mention either the place that they come from or the relationships in which they are located with other members of their family. Sometimes they also talk about their relationship with Buddhism. And so all these things, sometimes they also mention their profession. So all these things put together provide us information about these individuals. Now, while these inscriptions have been studied by scholars, they have come out with some very, very startling and very, very interesting findings. For example, out of roughly 800 inscriptions found in Sanchi, not one inscription mentions the caste identity of the individual involved. That's fascinating because normally we assume that the early Indian universe was defined by the caste identity much more than anything. In fact, studies of Buddhism tend to say that Buddhism was a revolt against the caste system. That might well be, but we need to think about it that in a particular Buddhist monuments, more than 800 people who who come and give gifts and who identify themselves through their professions, through their gender identity, through the place identity. They don't talk about their caste identity at all. So this is something that we need to rethink. Some scholars have pointed out that possibly Sanchi became a very important settlement because it was located on the trade network which is called Uttarapath and Dakshinapath. They believe that there were these trade networks which connected cities like Sravasti, Kaushambi and Ujjain, and since Sanchi was located near the city of Vidisha, it fell on that trade route, and that could explain its prosperity. Their point of view is further strengthened by the fact that many of the donors at Sanchi were Sethi, which is normally translated as bankers, or for that matter were called Vanik, which means trader. However, there is a problem with this kind of understanding. The problem being that so far as Buddhism is concerned, Buddhism does not approve of or doesn't prescribe the life of trading for a normal Buddhist monk. So we do not have any situation where a Buddhist monk is also participating in trade. Inside Sanchi also, we have not come across any area where excavations could yield evidence for some craft activity or some trading activity. We have a large number of rooms which are meant to be residence for Buddhist monks. We have a large number of monasteries, we have a large number of stupas, but there isn't any evidence for any craft activity in this area. Because of this, we need to again be careful about such sweeping generalizations that have been made about Buddhism and about Sanchi. The other generalization that has been made is that probably the prosperity of Sanchi was related to the fact that it was in close proximity to this famous city of Vidisha. Now this is also a problematic because Sanchi is located at a distance of 9 kilometers from the city of Vidisha. Now that's a long distance, and the idea that Buddhist monks could actually go for begging to the city of Vidisha seems to be unlikely, because a journey to and from Vidisha to Sanchi would roughly consume about 3 to 4 hours for a Buddhist monk. It's more likely that the Buddhist monks who were expected to go out as a routine for begging, they will be going to the surrounding settlements which probably existed around the settlement of Sanchi itself. So it cannot be that what was happening here cannot really be explained in terms of its proximity to the city of Vidisha. This fact is also buttressed by the fact that if we look at the number of donors who came and gave donations in this particular settlement of Sanchi, we find that donors from Vidisha were in smaller numbers compared to donors from places like Ujjain or Kuraghar for that matter. So probably it was not very closely connected with Sanchi. There have been other studies of Sanchi. There have been studies by Kumkum Roy, who points out that if we study the status of women at Sanchi, we realize that people at Sanchi represented a community which was already divided along gender lines. It also shows that already women were subjects of various forms of discrimination in a patrilineal male-dominated society. She has also found that Sanchi shows that women tended to patronize this religious tradition much more than men. Her explanation being that Buddhism, in a certain sense, provided greater opening to women than the Brahmanical tradition. Professor Romila Thapar has also studied the inscriptions of Sanchi, and she has pointed out that inscriptions of Sanchi perhaps represent the earliest examples of emergence of a religious community which cuts across lines of caste, class and region, and which tries to identify itself as one unified group, unified in its adherence to religious tradition. Now, if we look at the list of names that are found in Sanchi, names of places from where people came to Sanchi, we come across some startling evidences. There are more than 200 names of places mentioned in Sanchi. Unfortunately, most of these places have not been identified in the present time. We can identify some places like Ujjain, like Nandinagar, like Vidisha or Mathura for that matter. But most of the places remain unidentified. What is important, however, is that these places have name endings like which end with words like ta, da, so they will have names like Vat, Vati, Kat, etc. Now these are important to us because we know that what is called retroflex consonants like ta, tha, da, dha, they were part of the Dravidian family of languages. Originally, these letters were not part of the family of languages which is called the Indo-European family of languages. They became part of Indo-European family of languages over a period of time starting from the later Vedic period as such. So if there are places that are being mentioned which have ta, da or which end with words like kat, wat or vati, they probably indicate influence of the Dravidian language tradition. It's an interesting contrast because if we look at the names of places where evidence for early historical period have been found, in Madhya Pradesh, we find that not one of them has a name ending like Vat, Kat, etc. What has happened in these 1000 years or so is that names which had influences of Dravidian languages somehow seem to have disappeared, and they seem to have been replaced by name endings which are closer to the Indo-European language traditions. So what we are trying to talk about is that possibly through this long period of history, the Dravidian tradition of language was being gradually replaced by Indo-European tradition of language. What also is important for us is that out of about 606 inscriptions which provide some form of identity to the donors, there are 377 that relate to place. There are about 127 that talk about kinship, and there are about 50 cases where individuals identify themselves through their profession. Now, this is important for us because in a very, very important tradition of sociology, it has been said that in India, what exists is the caste, and villages are simply spatial expressions for the reality of caste. What is being pointed out is that in this kind of understanding, caste is considered more important than a place identity for that matter. It's believed that most of the decisions in the life of an individual or in the life of a kinship group or in the life of a family in India, most of these decisions are taken by the caste group rather than by the village. The village itself is divided into different caste groups who seem to be leading autonomous existence. However, if we were to examine the evidence from Sanchi, people in Sanchi are all the time defining themselves, identifying themselves with the places that they belong to. They, as I mentioned earlier, not once do they talk about their caste identities. So they definitely had some notion of affinity or connectedness with the places that they came from, much more so than probably the caste identities that we could think of. Similarly, some historians have pointed out that loyalty to places emerged as a result of the emergence of feudal economies after the 4th, 5th century AD. It has been pointed out that significant changes took place in Indian society after the 4th century AD, and that led to a localization of economy and religion. And this also created a situation where people developed greater sense of identity with place as such. However, if we were to examine the evidence from Sanchi, it seems that people felt loyal to places that they came from even in the 2nd century BC, long before the idea of feudalism was to come about in the 6th, 7th century AD as such. So the Sanchi evidence questions the idea of localization, as emergence of the idea of localization as a result of emergence of feudalism. We will be talking about some other issues that emerge from a study of Sanchi inscriptions in the next set of lectures. Thank you.